Bill Goldberg strode onto the late show stage with that unmistakable presence that had intimidated countless opponents for decades. The audience erupted, some fans instinctively chanting his name in that familiar cadence. No one in the Ed Sullivan Theater that night could have anticipated what was about to unfold, a conversation so unexpectedly powerful, so genuinely moving, that it would leave Stephen Colbert visibly stunned and transform an ordinary talk show appearance into a moment millions would still be discussing months later. The bustling New York studio hummed with excitement. Production assistants made final adjustments, the house band ran through their warm-up, and audience members settled into their seats, phones tucked away as instructed. Everyone anticipated the standard late-night formula. Some wrestling stories, a few jokes about Goldberg's intimidating persona, and perhaps a playful demonstration of his famous spear move. Backstage, Stephen Colbert reviewed his note cards, mentally rehearsing the witty remarks and transitions his team had crafted for this unique guest. The planned segments included playful wrestling references and questions about Goldberg's transition to Hollywood, reliable material for viral clips and social media moments. In the green room, Goldberg sat quietly imposing, dressed in a simple black t-shirt that accentuated his still impressive physique at 55, his trademark goatee now flecked with distinguished gray. Decades in the spotlight had taught him the expectations of these appearances, the unspoken contract between host, guest, and audience. But lately, something had been shifting within him, a growing weariness with the character he'd portrayed, a desire for something that felt more meaningful than the carefully maintained tough guy image. 5 minutes, Mr. Goldberg, called a production assistant, clipboard in hand, headset firmly in place. Goldberg nodded, his expression unreadable. He stood and rolled his massive shoulders, not an intimidation tactic now, but a centering ritual, a quiet preparation for what he had decided just that morning to share publicly for the first time. The show began with Colbert's monologue, sharp political humor and pop culture observations, with audience laughter punctuating each crafted punchline. Then came the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, my next guest is a wrestling legend, a WWE Hall of Famer who made "Who's Next?" one of the most feared questions in sports. Please welcome the one and only Bill Goldberg. The audience erupted as Bill walked out, the house band playing his entrance theme as he waved to the enthusiastic crowd. He embraced Colbert with surprising gentleness before settling into the guest chair, which seemed almost comically small beneath his substantial frame. "Bill, it's great to have you here," Colbert began with his characteristic enthusiasm. "I've got to say, this is a first for me, having someone on the show who could tear me in half with their bare hands." Goldberg laughed, that deep rumbling sound rarely heard during his wrestling promos. "Don't worry, Stephen. Those days are behind me. Mostly," he added with a playful wink. The audience laughed, settling in for what they expected to be a fun, light-hearted exchange with the wrestling icon. "So, you've got this new action film coming out, and there's a documentary about your life and career that's getting incredible early reviews," Colbert continued. "What's it like seeing your story told on screen?" Goldberg nodded, considering the question. "It's surreal, honestly. When you're living it day by day, match by match, you don't think about the larger narrative unfolding." Something in his tone made Colbert lean forward slightly, sensing a depth to the answer. "The documentary especially," Goldberg continued, "forced me to look at my career, my choices, in ways I hadn't been willing to before." The audience grew quieter, sensing a shift in the conversation's energy. "You know, Stephen, I've done countless interviews over the decades," Goldberg continued, his voice taking on a more reflective quality. "But watching this documentary, seeing my life played back to me, I realized there's a story I've never told publicly, a story that might matter more than the championships or the winning streak." Colbert, always skilled at reading the room, set aside his prepared questions. "I'm listening," he said simply. Goldberg took a deep breath, the kind that precedes something true, something unscripted. "Most people know I came to wrestling late after my football career ended. I was 30 years old, starting something completely new, completely foreign, in an industry that typically chews up and spits out newcomers." He shifted slightly in his chair, which creaked softly under his substantial weight. "What most people don't know is why I agreed to try wrestling in the first place, what I was going through in those months after football was over, when everything I'd worked for since I was a kid suddenly disappeared overnight." The audience was completely still now, all phones forgotten, all attention fixed on this unexpected turn in the conversation. "I was lost," Goldberg said simply, the two words hanging in stark contrast to the invincible character he had portrayed for decades. Depression doesn't begin to describe it. I'd wake up with no purpose, no direction. My body still strong, but my spirit just broken. His voice remained steady, but there was an emotional weight to his words that resonated throughout the theater. And the thing about being a man my size, with my background, in the culture I grew up in, is that there's no space for that kind of vulnerability, no language for that kind of struggle. Colbert nodded thoughtfully. There's still such stigma around mental health, especially for men, and I imagine even more so in professional sports. Exactly, Goldberg agreed. You're supposed to be tough, supposed to push through, supposed to figure it out. And when you can't, when each day feels like you're carrying this weight that keeps getting heavier, you start to believe there's something fundamentally wrong with you. A camera caught a man in the audience nodding emphatically, recognition written across his face, his reaction mirroring what many were feeling. "The lowest point came about a month before I got the call about wrestling," Goldberg continued, his voice steady but quieter now. "I was sitting in my car in the garage, engine running, windows up, just contemplating." The studio fell so silent you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the collective breath held as the implication of his words sank in. Something stopped me that day, some tiny spark of hope or purpose, I don't know, but I turned off the engine and called a friend. Probably saved my life with that one decision. Colbert, visibly moved, asked quietly, "Did you get help after that?" Goldberg nodded. "Not immediately, not properly, but when wrestling came along, it gave me something I desperately needed. Purpose, identity, direction. It quite literally saved me." He looked out at the audience briefly, not performing for them anymore, but including them in a moment of shared humanity. The irony isn't lost on me that I found healing in a profession where I portrayed this unstoppable force, this man without weakness, without vulnerability, when inside I was fighting battles nobody saw. A woman in the front row wiped a tear, her husband's arm around her shoulders, the camera catching this moment of connection. The character of Goldberg became both a shield and a prison in some ways, protection from my vulnerabilities, but also a barrier to authentic connection. Colbert, genuinely engaged now beyond any hosting duties, asked, "What changed? What made you decide to share this now, after all these years?" Goldberg's eyes softened, looking somewhere beyond the studio. 3 months ago, I got a letter from a fan, a former Marine, tough as they come, who wrote that he'd been planning to take his life after struggling with PTSD for years. He paused, the weight of this connection hanging in the air between him and Colbert. He happened to watch an old interview where I briefly mentioned struggling after football ended, just a passing comment I probably shouldn't have made according to my public image at the time. His voice remained steady, but his eyes revealed the emotional impact of what he was sharing. This Marine wrote that something about seeing even that tiny crack in the armor from someone he perceived as unbreakable made him reconsider, made him seek help instead. The studio was completely silent, even the cameramen seemingly holding their breath as Goldberg continued. He ended his letter saying, "You saved my life without even knowing it. Imagine how many others you could help if you shared your whole story." Goldberg's massive hands, capable of such power, now rested open on his knees in a gesture of vulnerability. That letter arrived the same week I was reviewing an early cut of the documentary. I watched this narrative of invincibility, superhuman strength, and confidence, and it just felt incomplete. Important, but incomplete. He looked directly at Colbert now with an intensity that had nothing to do with his wrestling persona. So, I called the director and asked if we could add something, if I could talk about the darkness that preceded the spotlight, the weakness that existed alongside the strength. Colbert nodded, clearly moved by Goldberg's candor. "That couldn't have been an easy decision, given the persona you've maintained for so long." "It wasn't," Goldberg acknowledged. "There were plenty of people around me concerned about what it might do to the legacy, the brand, the marketability of Goldberg as this untouchable force." A hint of his familiar intensity returned, but directed at something different now. "But I kept thinking about that Marine, about how many others might be out there, men especially, who need to hear that strength, real strength, includes acknowledging vulnerability, includes asking for help when you need it. The audience began to applaud spontaneously, not prompted by any applause sign or studio cue, but moved by the genuine courage unfolding before them. When the applause subsided, Colbert asked, "The documentary comes out next month. How much of this story made it into the final cut?" "All of it," Goldberg said simply. "The full story, the darkness and the light, because that's the truth, and at this point in my life, truth matters more than image." He shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, his expression earnest in a way rarely seen during his wrestling career. "You know, I spent decades projecting invincibility, convincing everyone, sometimes even myself, that I was this unstoppable force when the reality was much more complicated." Colbert nodded. "That's true for most of us, though perhaps not on such a public stage." "That's just it," Goldberg continued, intensity building in his voice. "We're all fighting battles nobody sees, carrying weights nobody knows about. And the tragedy is that we do it alone, convinced that vulnerability equals weakness when actually it's the source of our deepest connections." A man in the audience called out, "Truth!" Others nodded emphatically, the connection in the room palpable and profound. "I look at my son now," Goldberg continued, softness returning to his voice. "He's 14, trying to figure out what it means to be a man in this world, and I think about what I want to model for him." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Do I want him to believe that strength means never showing pain, never asking for help, never admitting when you're struggling? Or do I want him to know that real courage, real power, comes from being fully human, vulnerabilities and all?" The question hung in the air, resonating with parents throughout the studio. "And that's ultimately why I'm talking about this now, not just for that Marine or the others like him, but for my son, for the next generation of men who need better models of what strength means." The audience rose to their feet spontaneously, a standing ovation not for Goldberg, the wrestling legend, but for Bill, the human being, the father, the man brave enough to show vulnerability in a culture that had rewarded him for concealing it. Colbert stood too, extending his hand to Goldberg, who pulled him into a gentle embrace instead. As the applause continued, the camera caught the genuine emotion on both men's faces, a moment of authentic human connection rarely seen on television. "We need to take a break," Colbert said when the applause finally quieted. "But when we come back, more with Bill Goldberg." As the cameras cut away for commercial, the energy in the studio remained electric. Audience members turned to each other, sharing their reflections. Stage managers and cameramen exchanged glances of amazement. One whispered to another, "Did that just happen? Goldberg of all people?" In the control room, producers watched in awe, knowing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not a viral moment manufactured for views, but a genuine human connection that would resonate far beyond the usual metrics of success. The show's social media manager frantically typed notes, knowing this segment would need special handling, knowing it had transcended the typical celebrity promotion to become something people would still be discussing long after the usual pop culture moments had faded. When they returned from the commercial, Colbert acknowledged the uncommon nature of what had just transpired. "I want to thank you, Bill, for that incredible honesty," he said sincerely. "I think everyone here feels like they just witnessed something truly important." Goldberg nodded, his expression both vulnerable and strong in a combination that somehow made perfect sense now. "Thank you for creating the space for it," he replied. "These conversations need to happen more often, especially among men." "I couldn't agree more," Colbert said, then smiled gently. "Though I admit, I never expected Bill Goldberg to be the one leading that particular charge." The audience laughed warmly, as did Goldberg, the tension easing slightly. "Life is full of surprises," he said with a genuine smile. "Who would have thought the guy famous for spearing people through tables would end up talking about emotional vulnerability on late-night TV?" They transitioned to discussing the documentary further, the upcoming film, and his family life, but something had fundamentally changed. The usual promotional veneer had been pierced, replaced by something more authentic that colored even these lighter exchanges. By the time the segment ended with Goldberg good-naturedly teaching Colbert his famous pre-match intensity ritual, the audience had experienced something rare in the landscape of late-night television. A genuine human connection that transcended the usual expectations of celebrity appearance. As Goldberg waved goodbye to the enthusiastic crowd, as the house band played him off stage, Everyone present knew they had witnessed something they would remember long after they'd forgotten most talk show moments. By morning, clips of the interview were everywhere, not selected for humor or wrestling nostalgia, but shared for their courage, their authenticity, and their potential to help others struggling silently. Goldberg just changed how we talk about mental health, trended across social media. Comment sections filled with personal reflections, particularly from men sharing their battles with depression, purpose, and identity. Suicide prevention hotlines reported increased calls, particularly from military veterans and young men, many citing Goldberg's words as the catalyst that gave them the courage to reach out. A psychology professor at the University of Michigan showed the clip to his class on masculinity and mental health. "This is what changing culture looks like in real time," he told his students, "when unlikely messengers deliver crucial messages." A veterans support group in Texas used the segment as a starting point for discussion about PTSD and hope. A high school football coach in Georgia shared it with his team, opening a conversation about strength that transcended physical prowess. What made the interview resonate wasn't celebrity, but authenticity. The courage to challenge expectations with such thoughtfulness and purpose by someone people had only ever seen through the lens of invincibility and intimidation. 3 days later, at a suicide prevention fundraiser, Goldberg appeared without cameras, without publicity, simply to connect with others, to listen to their stories, to lend his newly revealed vulnerability to the cause. A young man approached him, voice shaking. "I've been a fan since I was a kid, had all your posters on my wall, but seeing you talk about what you went through made me finally call the counseling center at my college. I'd been putting it off for months, scared of seeming weak." Goldberg embraced him, strength and compassion combined in the gesture. "That's not weakness, brother," he said quietly. "That's the bravest thing you could have done." No cameras captured this exchange, no publicists orchestrated it, just human connection, the kind he had spoken about with such conviction on the show. In Seattle, at a media panel discussion the following week, Colbert was asked about the now famous segment. "In 20 years of doing this," he reflected, "that might be the most unexpected and meaningful exchange I've ever been part of on television." He paused, considering his words carefully. "We talk a lot about representation in media, usually in terms of visible diversity, but there's also representation of experience, of struggle. And when someone like Bill Goldberg, whose entire career was built on projecting invulnerability, speaks about his darkest moments with such honesty, he makes it safer for countless others to do the same." A week later, the WWE issued a statement announcing a new mental health initiative for current and former wrestlers, with Goldberg as its first spokesperson. The statement acknowledged the unique pressures of performing invincibility while being human and the toll that takes over time. In living rooms across America, viewers who had tuned in expecting celebrity anecdotes and wrestling nostalgia found themselves in unexpected conversations about mental health, vulnerability, about redefining strength. A father in Dallas used the segment to talk with his teenage sons about pressure and expectations. A coach in Philadelphia revisited his approach to motivation, questioning the mental toughness he had always demanded. A veteran in Montana finally called the VA hotline after years of silent struggling. The ripples continued outward, not in the dramatic, quantifiable ways that media outlets typically measure, but in the quiet, profound shifts that happen when truth disrupts expectation, when vulnerability replaces performance, when connection overcomes isolation. 6 months later, when Goldberg's documentary was released to critical acclaim and unprecedented audience response, particularly from demographics not typically associated with wrestling content, interviewers inevitably asked about that night on The Late Show and its aftermath. "The response has been humbling," he would say, that familiar intensity now directed toward a new purpose. "Every day I hear from people, especially men, who've spent their lives believing they had to be invulnerable, unbreakable, unstoppable, just like the character I portrayed." His expression would soften then, the humanity behind the icon fully visible now. "And while I'm proud of my career, my championships, what matters most now is helping change the conversation about strength, about masculinity, about what it means to be powerful." What had begun as a standard late-night appearance had evolved into something far more meaningful, a cultural touchstone, a reference point for conversations about mental health and manhood, about the courage to challenge expectations, about the freedom found in vulnerability. Goldberg returned to his life, Colbert to his show, the audience to their daily challenges, but something had shifted, however slightly. A reminder that beneath our public personas, our carefully maintained images, our professional accomplishments and failures, we share this fundamental human experience of strength and fragility, courage and fear, purpose and uncertainty. That night on The Late Show hadn't been about promotion. It had been about transformation, about the potential of truth to challenge perceptions, about the power of vulnerability to forge a connection in a world that often rewards silence and stoicism. And in a media landscape increasingly defined by performance and polarization, by manufactured moments and strategic branding, that kind of authentic human exchange wasn't just refreshing, it was revolutionary. In an industry built on image and spectacle, Goldberg had chosen substance and truth, not for acclaim or attention, but because he understood that our greatest strength often lies in acknowledging our deepest struggles, not just for our healing, but for everyone still suffering in silence. If this story moved you, if you recognized yourself in any part of it, if you're carrying burdens that feel too heavy, or know someone who might be, remember that true strength isn't found in never falling, but in the courage to get back up, to reach out for help when needed, to show others that even the strongest among us are, ultimately, human, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply tell the truth.